The awakening of the empath. There is a silence that hums beneath every empath's life, a vibration not heard but felt, like the lingering note of a bell that was struck long before birth. It is the echo of the world itself, rippling through the sensitive soul, pulling them toward what is unseen yet painfully real. They are born attuned to frequencies most people never notice, the sadness behind laughter, the tension hidden in words, the trembling between breaths. This sensitivity is not a weakness but a kind of ancient inheritance, the memory of an age when spirit and matter were still in conversation. Empaths carry this forgotten dialogue within them. They stand between realms, one foot in the visible world of forms, the other resting in the undercurrents of the collective unconscious. But such openness, though sacred, is perilous, for to feel everything is to risk forgetting where one's own boundaries begin. What begins as compassion can quietly become erosion. The empath's soul, vast as an ocean, slowly dissolves into the tides of others until the shore of identity blurs. The first whispers of loss come not as pain but as exhaustion, the kind that seeps through even in silence. You cannot see the wound, yet you feel its gravity. It is the weight of unfiltered life. Jung once wrote that, the greater the sensitivity, the greater the need for structure, and yet empaths often mistake structure for coldness. They keep their hearts open even as they drown. To be an empath is to live inside mirrors. Every reflection offers truth, but also the danger of disappearance. For in seeing too much of others, they begin to lose sight of themselves. When the empath listens, they do not simply hear, they resonate. Every vibration becomes personal. The grief of a stranger passes through their body as their own. The joy of a friend makes their chest glow with warmth that isn't entirely theirs. Life becomes a chorus of borrowed feelings. And yet, beneath this chorus, the soul whispers, remember what is yours. To feel deeply is divine, but to forget the self within that depth is to mistake devotion for dissolution. The empath's first task is not to harden, but to anchor, to realize that love without boundaries is not purity. It is self-erasure disguised as virtue. The world does not need more open wounds pretending to be compassion. It needs conscious hearts, souls that can hold the collective ache without becoming its victim. When the empath begins to understand this, a subtle shift occurs. The silence that once hurt becomes music. The feelings that once overwhelmed begin to flow through them like wind through reeds. They do not stop feeling. They simply stop confusing every vibration for a command. And in that moment of clarity, they awaken to the first pattern, the reflection of pain, and begin to see that the sorrow they carry is not all their own. The reflection of pain, the first pattern. The empath's initiation begins in mirrors. They do not seek them. They are born surrounded by them. The eyes of others, the shifting weather of emotion, the invisible tides of collective memory. Every surface reflects something back, yet not all reflections belong to them. It starts subtly. They sense another's sadness, and before thought can intervene, their body trembles as though struck by the same grief. They believe this resonance to be compassion. They think, I feel what you feel, therefore I love you. But love and merging are not the same. What feels like union often hides confusion, the blurring of psychic edges where identity begins to dissolve. This is the pattern of reflection, the most seductive of all. It begins as empathy and ends as possession. Jung would have called it participation mystique, the ancient state in which the self and the world are not yet separate. The modern empath lives in that archaic field every day, pulled back toward a kind of psychological Eden where boundaries never existed. Dreams will warn them long before the mind does. Mirrors without faces, voices speaking through fog, rooms where emotions have shape but no source. The unconscious is showing them what they cannot yet say aloud. You are reflecting what is not yours. When this happens, the empath's energy becomes a hall of echoes. Every unspoken sorrow reverberates inside them, until they mistake the world's lament for their own heartbeat. The nervous system, that delicate instrument of perception, begins to overplay its song. Fatigue arrives like a tide. To awaken from the pattern of reflection is to polish the mirror and hold it upright. To look at pain and whisper, I see you, but you are not mine. It is not withdrawal, it is discernment. The empath does not have to close their heart to stay whole, only to know what enters it. This act of awareness transforms empathy from suffering into service. Feeling becomes perception. The mirror no longer steals the image, it illuminates it. And as this first pattern dissolves, the empath glimpses the next, the shimmering temptation to heal what they have just stopped carrying. Compassion whispers again, this time disguised as duty. The psyche leans forward, ready to serve, unaware that the second snare is already waiting. The Savior's burden, the second pattern. Every empath carries an ancient memory, a soft echo of a world once whole, before the psyche fractured into healer and wounded, giver and receiver. Somewhere within, there lingers a silent vow. If I can mend what is broken in others, the world will love me back. This vow is never spoken aloud, yet it becomes the secret axis around which their life turns. It is the root of the second pattern, the Savior's burden. It begins innocently. The empath notices suffering and feels a call rise from the depths, an almost holy impulse to help. It feels divine, as if some greater purpose were awakening. And perhaps it is at first. But what starts as compassion often bends under the weight of unconscious guilt. They mistake resonance for responsibility. They hear pain and believe it is their duty to silence it. Jung wrote that the archetype of the healer is both medicine and poison. When we identify with it too fully, we begin to believe we are the cure. And that belief, so noble on the surface, feeds a deeper hunger, the desire to feel needed, to prove worth through rescue. The empath, drawn by invisible gravity, finds themselves carrying the emotional burdens of friends, partners, even strangers. They listen until they are hollow. They offer light until their own flame wavers. The exhaustion feels virtuous. They confuse depletion for devotion. Yet true healing does not demand self-erasure. It requires presence, not sacrifice. The soul cannot serve if it has dissolved. The unconscious, always the patient teacher, begins to send dreams of endless staircases, broken wings, or water spilling from a cracked vessel. These are not punishments. They are metaphors. The psyche is whispering, your well is sacred, but it must be full to give. The empath must learn to bow before their limits as one bows before a temple. Their boundaries are not fences but thresholds, places where compassion becomes conscious. Without them, love turns to martyrdom, and so the awakening deepens. To save another is sometimes to deny them the grace of their own becoming. Pain too has its wisdom, and not every wound is ours to close. When the empath learns this, their love begins to mature. It softens, steadies, and finally breathes. They start to understand that guidance is not carrying, it is illumination. And as they step out of the Savior's burden, a new shadow stirs beneath the surface, the shadow of mimicry, of becoming so attuned to others that one forgets the shape of one's own soul. The pattern of emotional mimicry, the third pattern. There is a subtle art in how an empath survives childhood. They learn without instruction that harmony keeps them safe. A parent sighs, and their stomach tightens. A room grows tense, and their breath shortens to match it. They calibrate instinctively, reshaping themselves to maintain balance. What began as sensitivity becomes survival. This ancient mechanism still hums within the adult empath, the reflex to mirror emotion before it becomes threat. And thus emerges the third pattern, emotional mimicry. It is invisible to those who live inside it. The empath thinks they are simply kind, adaptable, compassionate. But underneath, something deeper moves. The unconscious belief that peace depends on matching the emotional weather of others. Around the anxious, they become restless. Around the angry, their own pulse hardens. Around the broken-hearted, their chest caves in sympathy. It feels noble, this chameleon heart, but over time the cost becomes unbearable. The empath's own emotional tone begins to fade. Days pass, filled with feeling, yet strangely hollow. They can describe others with perfect accuracy, but stumble when asked, "What do you feel?" The unconscious mirrors this confusion through dream imagery, masks upon masks, crowds without faces, a voice calling from behind glass. The message is clear. You are forgetting your own frequency. Jung might have called this the loss of effective differentiation, the point where empathy becomes contagion. It is a regression into the primal herd consciousness, where identity dissolves for safety. But individuation, the soul's deepest task, demands separation. To evolve, the empath must reclaim solitude as a sacred fire, not a punishment. In solitude, the mimic trembles. The absence of borrowed emotion feels like death, yet if they endure the silence long enough, something miraculous happens. An inner song begins to rise, faint but unmistakable. It is their own emotional signature, untouched by imitation. The empath learns to dwell in that silence without rushing to fill it. It is not emptiness, and it is recovery, the psyche remembering its own voice after centuries of echo. And with this remembrance, empathy transforms again. It ceases to be mimicry and becomes resonance, not a blind reflection, but a conscious attunement. The empath begins to feel from within, not for. They no longer blend to survive, they harmonize to create. But as they stabilize in their own vibration, a quieter shadow appears, a whisper that says, "You owe the world your presence. You must give more." And thus begins the fourth pattern, the invisible debt that binds compassion to guilt. The cycle of invisible debt, the fourth pattern. Guilt has many disguises, but for the empath it often wears the mask of virtue. It whispers, "Because you understand, you owe." It does not shout. It seeps, subtle as breath, wrapping around every act of kindness until compassion becomes obligation. This is the fourth pattern, the cycle of invisible debt. It begins in innocence. The empath helps because they care, but somewhere between the giving and the receiving, something sacred tilts out of balance. The unconscious begins to weave a false equation. Understanding equals responsibility. They start to believe that every tear they witness must be wiped by their own hand, that to rest while others suffer is selfish, that peace is earned only through exhaustion. This guilt is not moral. It is ancestral. It echoes through lineages of caretakers and mystics who believed that suffering sanctified love. Their stories live in the empath's bones, whispering that to serve is to atone. And so, they stay, in relationships long expired, in jobs that drain them, in conversations that slice away their energy like slow erosion. Leaving would feel like betrayal, as though choosing themselves were an act of cruelty. But guilt, Jung said, is often the shadow of misplaced responsibility. It binds us not to people but to patterns. The unconscious begins to reveal the truth through dreams, climbing endless staircases, paying debts that never clear, carrying bags that refill themselves. The message is ancient. You cannot buy peace with pain. To break this cycle, the empath must confront the internal judge, that stern archetype that measures love in suffering. They must look it in the eye and ask, who benefits from my depletion? Often there is no villain, only the echo of an old survival strategy. As children, they learned that calmness kept the peace, that giving kept them safe. To stop giving now feels like tearing the thread that holds the world together. But the world does not need their exhaustion. It needs their awareness. When the empath realizes that guilt is not a sign of compassion but of confusion, the heart begins to loosen. They start to see that boundaries are not cruelty but clarity, that saying no is not abandonment but alignment. The weight begins to fall away, the air tastes new, and then from the empty space where guilt once lived, something luminous arises, a quiet self-respect, delicate but unshakable. This is the turning point in the empath's journey. Compassion begins to breathe again, no longer tangled in penance. They finally understand that the world's pain is not a debt to be paid, but a mirror to be seen. Yet as soon as the heart rests in peace, another temptation stirs, the craving for intensity. After so many years of chaos, calm feels foreign, even frightening. The soul begins to hunger for the familiar storm, and thus awakens the fifth pattern, the addiction to emotional intensity. The addiction to emotional intensity, the fifth pattern. After years of living through the emotions of others, calmness can feel like emptiness to an empath. Silence, once sacred, begins to taste like absence. The nervous system, long attuned to turbulence, now associates peace with boredom. This is the hidden danger that arises after healing has begun, the subconscious craving for chaos. This is the fifth pattern, the addiction to emotional intensity. At first, it feels like passion. The empath believes that only in the depths of emotional extremes can truth be found. They seek relationships that shake them, conversations that burn, music that tears open the chest. They mistake equilibrium for stagnation, serenity for numbness. But Jung warned that what the ego calls passion, the psyche often calls repetition. Emotional intensity becomes a substitute for intimacy, an imitation of depth. The empath's mind, addicted to adrenaline and catharsis, begins to chase emotional highs and lows like a pendulum that refuses to rest. They tell themselves they crave honesty, but it is not honesty they seek, it is sensation. They want to feel more than they want to understand. The body becomes a battlefield for borrowed storms. The heart races at every confrontation. The mind spins with every new attachment. The soul confuses volatility with vitality. Dreams begin to shift from mirrors to storms. Crashing waves, burning cities, violent weather, symbols of energy uncontained. The unconscious is shouting now. Intensity is not intimacy. But how could they know? Since childhood, emotion has been their compass. They learned that love must shake them to be real, that stillness means abandonment. In the absence of emotional fire, they fear becoming invisible. The truth is simpler and far more liberating. Peace is not the absence of feeling. It is the refinement of it. It is what happens when awareness replaces reactivity, when emotion serves understanding rather than devouring it. To awaken from this fifth pattern, the empath must learn a new kind of ecstasy, the quiet ecstasy of presence. They must wean the psyche from its addiction to drama and let the nervous system rediscover stillness as safety. This requires courage, because stillness exposes what the storm concealed. Beneath the waves of excitement lies grief, and beneath grief lies fear, the fear of emptiness, the fear of existing without chaos. But emptiness is not death. It is the fertile void from which consciousness expands. When the empath finally allows stillness to touch them, they discover that emotion does not vanish. It deepens. Joy becomes quieter, but more enduring. Sorrow becomes sacred rather than heavy. Love becomes spacious rather than consuming. Jung called this enantiodromia, the transformation of one extreme into its opposite. Out of chaos, clarity is born. The empath who passes through this stage begins to radiate a different energy, no longer reactive but steady. People feel calm in their presence, not because they suppress emotion, but because they have transmuted it. They have discovered that serenity too can burn, not as wildfire but as a steady flame that illuminates without consuming. And as they rest in that inner stillness, a subtler shadow approaches, the oldest and most intimate of all, the shadow of fusion, the longing to lose oneself completely in love. The shadow of emotional fusion, the sixth pattern. Love is the most beautiful mirror, and the most dangerous. The empath, whose heart was born without armor, looks into that mirror and vanishes. They call it devotion, but beneath the tenderness lies disappearance. This is the sixth pattern, the shadow of emotional fusion. It begins quietly as all illusions do. The empath meets another soul and feels recognition, not the simple recognition of personality, but the haunting memory of having known them before time began. The connection feels fated, sacred, absolute. Boundaries soften, then dissolve. They no longer know where one heartbeat ends and the other begins. To the empath, this merging feels divine, but what the soul experiences as union, the psyche endures as possession. Their moods, desires, and even dreams begin to synchronize. The empath mistakes resonance for identity, reflection for self. Jung called this phenomenon the loss of individuation. It is the most subtle form of unconsciousness, the sacred self dissolving into another's energy field. The archetype at play here is the lover, but an unbalanced lover becomes a devourer, consuming itself in the fire of attachment. The empath begins to speak in the language of we, forgetting the holy pronoun I. They give without pause, absorb without question, until even their silence begins to echo with another's voice. They believe this is love, but it is love's shadow, its intoxicated twin. And yet even in that intoxication, the unconscious keeps sending warnings, dreams of entanglement, of vines that tighten, of oceans with no surface. The message is clear. You are drowning in someone else's tide. To awaken from this pattern is not to retreat from love, but to rediscover it in its truer form. Love was never meant to be a cage, nor a flood. It was meant to be a bridge, two shores meeting in freedom. The empath must remember that union without separation is not intimacy but collapse. It takes two whole souls to love, To dissolve is to abandon the gift that made the meeting possible, individuality. When they dare to step back into their own light, terror arises. If I stop merging, the empath fears, I will be alone. But solitude is not loneliness. It is clarity. It is the space in which love matures from hunger into offering. Boundaries, once mistaken for rejection, reveal themselves as the true architecture of connection. Without form, even light cannot shine. Without edges, there is no art, only blur. As the empath relearns to stand in the full shape of their being, something extraordinary occurs. Love begins to breathe again, not as grasping, but as grace. It no longer pulls, it flows. It no longer demands, it dances. And from that dance, a new silence is born. Not the silence of absence, but of wholeness. The empath feels it stirring deep within. A pull not toward others now, but toward the self. The longing is not for another's energy, but for the still voice that was buried beneath every merging. This marks the entrance into the seventh and final pattern, the return to silence, the healing that follows all storms. The return to silence in the seventh pattern. After the storms, after the mirrors, after every tear shed for sorrows not their own, the empath begins to feel something unfamiliar. Stillness. Not the stillness of numbness or retreat, but a sacred quiet, like the air before dawn. It frightens them at first, because it feels like nothing, and yet this nothing is everything they have been seeking. This is the seventh pattern of the return to silence. Silence, for the empath, is both a stranger and a homecoming. For so long their identity was woven through sound, through the cries, confessions, and vibrations of others. Now, in the absence of those frequencies, they are left face to face with themselves, and the self, unaccompanied, can seem vast and unknown. At first the mind panics. The absence of external noise feels like a void. Who am I if not the one who feels for everyone else? The ego trembles, for its purpose was built upon reflection, but in that trembling lies the threshold of awakening. Silence is not absence. It is awareness purified of interference. It is the space in which the soul begins to remember its original tone. When the empath sits in this silence long enough, a miracle begins. What once felt like emptiness starts to pulse with life. They feel the hum of their own energy, steady, golden, autonomous. They realize that peace is not lifelessness. It is alignment. The unconscious responds with new symbols. Calm waters under moonlight, luminous rooms filled with air, distant bells that echo but never fade. These are not dreams of warning, but dreams of return. The psyche is showing them their center, the self, the axis around which all opposites revolve. Jung wrote that individuation is not the pursuit of perfection, but of wholeness. The empath's journey was never about becoming pure light. It was about embracing every shadow until light could move freely through it. And now in this quiet they begin to see. They were never merely receivers of emotion nor healers of pain. They were the witnesses through which the world could feel itself. Empathy in its awakened form is not an exchange of energy but a revelation of unity. It is the recognition that there was never truly mine or yours, only currents in the same ocean, waves in the same body of being. From this realization, a profound peace arises, one that no chaos can touch. The empath's nervous system, once raw from constant resonance, now hums with stability. They no longer absorb, they transmute. They no longer drown, they float effortlessly within the sea of collective feeling. And in this silence, love itself changes shape. It no longer clings, it no longer aches, it simply is. Presence becomes prayer, breath becomes blessing. The world remains chaotic, but within, there is order, the order of a consciousness that finally knows itself. The empath has come full circle. From reflection to fusion, from chaos to clarity, from absorption to awareness. The heart that once bled now radiates light that heals without effort. And yet the journey is not over, for beyond silence lies understanding, the wisdom that all pain, all beauty, all empathy was the soul's way of remembering its divinity. That is where the epilogue begins. Epilogue, The Alchemy of Wholeness, Part 1. When Jung spoke of the self, he described not a personality but a field, a vast radiant intelligence that contains both shadow and light, both creation and decay. It is the inner axis upon which consciousness turns, the silent witness behind every thought and tear. The empath, through their descent and return, has come closer to that axis than most. Their suffering was not punishment, but initiation. Each emotional pattern, reflection, saviorhood, mimicry, debt, intensity, fusion, and silence was a gate through which the soul refined itself. What drained them before now becomes the very substance of their transformation. Pain, when met with awareness, is not an enemy. It is the fire that burns away illusion. The empath, once porous and lost, now understands this. They have learned to feel without drowning, to love without losing, to witness without absorbing. This is the beginning of true alchemy, not the turning of lead into gold, but of experience into wisdom. The alchemist does not destroy the darkness, they converse with it. They recognize that shadow is not opposed to light, but completes it. Every emotion the empath once feared, rage, grief, envy, desire, becomes a raw element of consciousness waiting to be refined. Integration is the sacred chemistry of the soul. Dreams begin to shift once more. The floodwaters recede. The mirrors clear. A new symbol emerges. The golden circle. The serpent devouring its own tail. The eternal return. The unconscious declares, the cycle is complete. In this stage, compassion no longer burns. It glows. The empath feels emotions move through them as clouds pass across the sky. Temporary, shapeless, beautiful. They no longer cling to what they feel, nor resist it. Emotion becomes language, not identity. They realize that every feeling, joy, sorrow, fear, desire, carries within it a hidden message from the unconscious. Fear asks for faith, anger asks for boundaries, grief asks for surrender, joy asks for gratitude. The empath, once lost in these sensations, now reads them as scripture. And with that literacy of the soul, empathy itself changes meaning. It is no longer a gift they carry, but a state of awareness they are. The line between healer and healed, between observer and observed, dissolves into unity. The world does not stop hurting, but the hurt becomes comprehensible, part of a vast pattern of becoming. Humanity, too, is an empath, absorbing its own pain until it learns to awaken. Through the awakened empath, that process accelerates. Their consciousness becomes medicine, not through action, but through presence. Wherever they go, they bring coherence to chaos simply by being. This is not mysticism. It is the natural order of energy when alignment replaces fragmentation. And so, as they stand in that quiet radiance, they begin to understand the true purpose of their sensitivity. It was never about carrying the world's pain. It was about teaching the world how to feel again, but with awareness. The empath who reaches this point does not withdraw from life. They re-enter it more fully than ever before. They become creators, artists, teachers, healers, not because they must, but because expression has become inevitable. Feeling has turned into meaning. Suffering has become song, and silence, that ancient hum beneath everything, now sings through them like breath through a flute. Epilogue, The Alchemy of Wholeness, Part 2 and Final. At the end of the long road, the empath no longer searches for healing, for they have become its embodiment. The world that once pierced them now passes through them like wind through light. They do not resist. They do not cling. They allow. Their presence itself has become prayer. When emotion rises, they no longer ask, "Why is this happening to me?" Instead, they listen. Each feeling is a messenger, each tremor an invitation. What once felt like chaos now moves in harmony, and what once drained them now nourishes them. Jung said that the self is both the wound and the healer, the crucifixion and the resurrection. The empath finally understands. They realize that their sensitivity was not a flaw, but an evolutionary organ of the soul, a way for life to taste itself more deeply. They remember what the mystics and the psychologists have always known. Empathy is not the sharing of pain. It is the recognition of oneness. In that recognition, separation dissolves. The empath does not lose individuality. They inhabit it as the divine would inhabit a vessel, fully, consciously, with grace. The I and the all are no longer opposites. They are mirrors reflecting infinity back upon itself. From this awareness, an entirely new way of living emerges. The empath becomes a quiet catalyst in the collective psyche, They no longer preach, they embody. Their calm steadiness ripples outward, altering the unseen architecture of human feeling. To meet such a person is to feel one's own soul remembered. They speak little, yet their silence heals. They act simply, yet their gestures echo in the unseen. In dreams, this stage reveals itself as light bursting through water, as a garden blooming after centuries of drought, as a child crowned with gold, symbols of wholeness restored. The psyche has completed its alchemy, emotion into essence, essence into awareness. The empath, once overwhelmed by sensation, now moves through life like a lucid dreamer, awake within the mystery. They see every face as their own, every sorrow as a mirror of the world's awakening. Judgment fades, understanding reigns, and when they look upon humanity, its confusion, its striving, its endless yearning, they no longer despair. They see a great organism remembering itself, cell by cell, heart by heart. The pain of the world is not meaningless. It is the labor of consciousness giving birth to itself. The empath's role, now fulfilled, is to midwife that birth, not by carrying the pain but by staying awake through it. Their compassion no longer drains. It radiates. It moves not from weakness but from wholeness. In this final silence, they understand the secret that every soul must one day learn. The purpose of feeling deeply was never to drown in life, but to become life itself. The circle closes. The silence that once haunted them now hums with peace. The vibration beneath all existence, that first faint sound of creation, sings again within their chest. And so the empath rests, not apart from the world, but as the world, luminous and aware. For in truth there was never a boundary at all, only love remembering its own reflection.